Let's get into specifics, first of which is Kevin Concepcion. I've been liking to say it that way just because it sounds fancy. And so, when we look at this, two of these guys we're going to talk about today are wide receivers. And Carolina already has two wide receivers, Christian Hamilton and Chris Culliver, in this class. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, let's start with KC. What do you see from him, and what do you think he will ultimately do?
Yeah, this is a fascinating recruit and recruitment to track. Concepcion brings a lot of versatility to the wide receiver spot. He's got some polish. I think he can put some routes together, but then he's also got this kind of physicality and top end speed that makes him a threat to go the distance at any given point. So I do like that kind of three-level impact in his game. He could be a possession guy, he could be considered a speed guy, or a counter player who kind of jumps in and out of each of those roles. So you could see why his recruitment has become a little bit more hectic here over the last few months. And I think that's where we're still at. North Carolina State. I think the Wolfpack had the buzz early, certainly in the spring into the summer months. But since that point, it seems much closer to a coin flip, almost 50-50 between the programs, so much so that KC had two visits to take at the very end of July, right before the dead period kicked back in, and he took visits to both schools. He was like, I had to go back to both once again. So it's that close in this conversation, and I think in between those two visits, those return visits to Chapel Hill and to Raleigh, it's just been a whole lot of sitting back and trying to split the hairs between these two programs. He has good relationships with both wide receivers coaches. Both head coaches have gotten involved in this recruitment as well. He's another kid who could fit kind of at both schools. So I think it's going to be really, really close. And this is becoming something we talk about a lot, right? UNC versus NC State, two programs that have dominated the recruiting within state lines. And no disrespect to Wake or Duke in that regard. But really, that's where the conversation has started. So I think this is going to be another one of those that we start to sort of judge, who's got the momentum between these two state powers, because this is a true head-to-head battle that, Carolina has absolutely made up ground for over the last few months. I think that last official visit and that positioning was really big for UNC, getting that last trip and then getting the return trip there before the dead period kicked in on August 1st, equally as big. I know Mack Brown specifically spent time with KC before he was able to get back out of town. So, yeah, I think it's really close, almost too close to call. You feel better about Billups, so I know we'll talk about here in a second. But it's really, really tight at this point, and you start to wonder, with those two receivers committed, is there room for four? That could maybe factor in at the 11th hour, especially because all these kids are committing right around the same time.
Exactly. Man, it's so interesting. Just the math, the calculus of it all is always so interesting. Just one quick aside. Is there any possibility that a third school sneaks in here, or just, especially given the return trips, like it's UNC, it's NC State, and nobody else is breaking those barriers?
Yeah, those were the last two officials and last two unofficials that he took. So it feels like it's really those two, unless he pushes things back, which we've seen happen, of course, and another school gets involved and throws a wrench into the conversation. But if he stays on the plan of making that mid-August commitment, I think he's going to be at one of these two ACC programs for sure.
Okay. And I mean, as a Carolina podcast, you have to like him being able to look and see what's happening now with somebody like Josh Downs, who can do all of those things that you just talked about in Casey's game. How often does that factor into, hey, I see myself in this guy that's there doing it right now, and I want to be the next that dude?
Oh, 100%, Isaac. I mean, that's something that is the easiest thing to sell. It's harder to say, we don't have this, but we want you to become this, than it is to say, hey, look, you see this guy right here? Hey, let's bring him up after practice. You could be him. You could be him in 2 years. You could be him in 3 years, and look what he's about to do, this season, NFL draft, all that fun stuff. It's so much easier to put a human into that role, and then you start to allow Josh to be an extension of the coaching staff and kind of explain, hey, when I was in your shoes, I was a similar player, XYZ. It's a lot easier to sell it when it is already there or presently there, right? It's easier to sell it with a current student versus saying, hey man, let me tell you about Akeem Nicks back in the day. This was the guy that,
Yeah.
that it's a harder sell because now these kids got to get on YouTube and try to figure out who these players are. When he's there in the flesh, that's about as a one-to-one a sell as you can make in recruiting, and certainly it makes Mack Brown's job a little bit easier.
Yeah, man, that's so interesting. Well, John, let me hold your feet to the fire a little bit. Although, obviously we won't take this to school. If you had to make a prediction on whether he winds up in Raleigh or Chapel Hill, what do you think for KC?
Whew, I think a week ago I'd said Raleigh for sure. The return trip at the end of the dead period does make me pause in that front just a little bit.
Yeah.
But now there's time in between that trip and the decision. So sometimes it does break back to that original trend. So I think 30,000 feet up, I'd probably lean NC State, but man,
Okay.
it's so very close. Per the kid, this isn't even speculation. Per the kid, it is this close. So it really could flip flop either way. And it also kind of makes me wonder, is the verbal commitment date the end of this recruitment? Right? How does that play out, especially when this
Great
kid is
point.
well traveled, has been to both schools so many times? If he picks NC State, does he pop into a UNC game? Or conversely, if he picks UNC, does he go visit Raleigh, during the season and check out one of their games there? That could be something to keep an eye on, because there's been a lot of fluidity with Carolina's wide receiver recruiting in this cycle, right? Big targets, hits, misses, momentum, certainly in early July when the two current commitments jumped on board. I do think that there's been some fluctuation. So, yeah, you got to keep an eye on the long term with these guys as well. But it's that close with KC, no doubt.